Thanks everyone for coming. So at a conference like this, we've got a lot of technologists who are really great at thinking about the details of the technology, thinking about how things will perform, really getting into the nitty-gritty of that. And I think maybe more recently, people have been getting more smart about thinking about cost as well. I think about a panel that I saw at another ARPA-E conference, maybe it was last year. Yet-Ming Cheng, the founder of A123 Systems, talked about how much, now that he's got a new startup, 24M, how much more detail he's putting into figuring out the costs that are involved. And if you know the story of A123, you can see why that's particularly important. So cost and performance are things that people are used to thinking about. But in this panel, I think I want to take it a different view here. And I think we'll get at cost and performance somewhat. But to think about the customer, to think about who is going to be consuming whatever it is that you're producing, and to think about how that changes the way you approach development of your technology. So we've got some brilliant guys here who can talk to us about the consumer and how they behave, how they think, and how that can make a crucial difference in your technology, actually making a difference in the world. So I should introduce myself. I'm Kevin Bullis. I am the Senior Editor for Energy at Technology Review Magazine. And our panelists here, starting at the far end, we have Dan Ariely, a professor of psychology and behavioral economics at Duke University. And he can provide some in-depth insights into the surprising ways consumers can behave and how they can be affected by subtle things like the wording of an item on a form, even. We have George Colony, the founder, chairman, and CEO of the respected firm Forrester Research, and has been tracking consumer behavior for many years, and he's made some prescient calls about the dot-com implosion, the rise of social computing. He's a top advisor to some top Fortune 100 companies, and one of the things he's talking about these days to them is how to make use of social channels, feedback from social channels to make products better. And then we've got Rolf Stromberger, the VP of Business Environment Strategy at BMW North America. And previously, he's been in charge of efforts in looking at CO2 emissions at BMW. He brings us word from inside a company that's thinking carefully about CO2 emissions and technology improvements in many different ways, and thinking about how tricky that can be to commercialize. I'd like to start out, if we could start out with Dan, if that's okay with you, and we're going to move this way. And they're each going to give a short presentation, a short talk about things that are interesting to them. And then I'm going to ask some questions. And then importantly, I'd like to take questions from the audience. So we're going to try to do a system here where you can text or go to a website to send questions to this tablet I have up here. We had some trouble with that in the previous session, so if that doesn't work, we have microphones too. But let's start out with that version. I think that can be a much more efficient way of getting through questions. So this is how to do that. So you can see that, and let's hear from Dan. Oh, I should say one more thing, sorry. Our panelists need to leave quickly at 3 o'clock, so we're going to try to move as quickly as we can.
So, from a behavioral economics perspective, the problem of caring about energy in general is the problem of now versus later. And if you think about it, it's something that we as human beings are bad in almost every possible aspect. So just think about the following. In the people in this room, how many of you in the last week have eaten more than you think you should? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you in the last month have exercised less than you think you should? Okay. How many of you have ever texted while driving? Okay. This is incredible, right? Because you realize it's dangerous and stupid and you can kill other people and yourself. And last question, how many people here have ever had unplanned, unprotected sex? Wow, very few. Okay. Now, if you think about all of those behaviors, what they have in common is that what's good for us right now is not good for us in the long term. And we all have these wonderful hopes for ourselves in the future. The problem is how we act on them in the present. So think about the following abstract question. Imagine I passed around some chocolate, when I asked you, what would you rather have? Half a box of chocolate right now, or a full box of chocolate in a week? And the chocolate was just there in your hand. Half a box now, or a full box in a week? How many people would wait a week for another half a box of chocolate? Okay, a few people. I'm willing to bet that if the chocolate was real, there will be fewer of you. But imagine we pushed the choices to the future. And we said, what would you rather have? A half a box of chocolate in a year, or a full box of chocolate in a year in a week? Now you realize, of course, it's the same question. It's asking you whether you're willing to wait another week for another half a box of chocolate. But phrased this way, in the future, how many people are willing to wait? I'm guessing everybody, right? In the future, we're wonderful people. We would exercise, we would diet, we would not text and drive. Of course, we never get to live in that future. And that's if you think about it, that's the inherent dilemma of energy, right? Saving energy is nothing that is fun right now, right? There's no immediate gratification. It's all about some long-term benefit. And in fact, with energy, it's more complex. Because if you took the following task and you say, let's search the world over for the problem that would maximize human apathy, you would come up with global warming. Think about it. All the things we know that lead to human apathy come together in global warming. Something that would happen long in the future, to other people first. We don't see it progressing. We don't see any particular person suffering. And anything we could do is a drop in the bucket. So with all of those things together, you can ask yourself whether we could get people to care. And I think the answer is basically no. Now, if we think that the answer is education or information, or we'll just tell people about that, ain't going to happen. Think about dieting. There's no person in the world that doesn't know that eating healthier is a better idea than eating badly. It's just it doesn't feel fun right now. So people don't do it. So, and energy is actually, it's much more complex because we don't just do it for ourselves, it's for other people and so on. So, this is the challenge, and the challenge is tremendous, and it's not going to be solved by information. So how are we going to solve that challenge? One approach, we have a couple of approaches we've been thinking about, but one approach is what we call reward substitution. And I'll give you a quick personal story. I used to have to take a very tough medication called interferon for 1.5 years. And every injection made me sick for about 14 hours. I would have to come home and inject myself, and I would be sick, get sick for a long time. But presumably, if I did it 3 times a week for 1.5 years, I would not get liver cirrhosis 30 years down the road. How did I get myself to do it? I basically started watching movies the moment I injected myself. Now, if you think about it, it's a strange idea, right? It's something that I would not do for a healthy liver, but I did for something much less important than liver, like movies, as long as it came right now. And this principle of reward substitution is the idea that people would not necessarily do the right thing for the right reason, but it doesn't mean we have to give up. Maybe we could get people to do the right thing for the wrong reason. And there's lots of possible wrong reasons. So what would happen, for example, if I got your kids to make you feel guilty about energy consumption? Or what would happen if we tied your social prestige to your energy consumption? Or what would happen if we made it into competition, guilt invoking, anything about human motivation? Human motivation has lots of elements. By the way, making money is one of those, right? So we can also pay people. But there's a lot of range of human motivation. And to realize that we need to take some of those motivations and tie them together with a feeling of with energy consumption or better energy behavior, I think is central. So the idea that people would say, ooh, let me do this because it will be better for the planet in 30 years from now is not going to work. The idea that somebody would say, let me do this now so I feel better now. So other people respect me, so I feel I'm competent, so I think I'm doing the job in the right way. Those are the directions. And in some sense it's a little bit offensive because it means we're kind of belittling people's skills in terms of thinking long term, but that's truly what we have to deal with. So we have to face reality and use some reward substitutions.
Thanks, and we'll have George go next. But I'd ask you to take advantage of these questions now because there was some delay that happened last time. So if you have a question from that, send it right away.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. Much appreciated. George Colony, CEO of Forrester Research. So we survey consumers all over the world. We survey about 85% of the world's consumers, including urban India, urban China. We miss about 15%, but we get a lot of the consumers in the world, and we look at their behavior, primarily around technology. And I want to pose a question to you. Many of you in the room are technologists, and you understand that technology is actually quite predictable. We can look at Moore's law, we can look at Hitachi's law. Hitachi's law is the law that storage is doubling in power every year for the same dollar. The network growth is very predictable. So we might imagine that it's easy to predict technology change. In fact, it is easy to predict that change. But it's very difficult to predict when the technology change will be accepted by people. And that's what we call the trust gap. In fact, Forrester, as we draw our technology curves, we can see that many other curves have to catch up to technology. Training, capital, organization, culture, etc. And it takes about 5 to 6 years before those cultural, I call them societal factors, catch up to the technology curves. But when those two curves intersect, then you get a technology thunderstorm. That's when suddenly we're using PCs or suddenly we're using tablets, etc. So there's a trust gap, meaning that the technology is available, but people won't use it. They don't trust it yet. Where do I buy a DVR? What is a DVR? I'll actually tell you a story. I brought a box home to my wife one night. She said, "No, what is this?" This was like 2001, 2002. She said, "Well, what is that?" I said, "Well, this is something called a DVR, and it records television. And it's a TiVo." She said, "I don't want that in my house. Take the box out of my house, get it out. I don't want to see it." I'm a technologist. She's not. And I said, here's the deal. I'm going to install this in our house, and in 2 weeks you tell me whether you want it in or out, and I'll do whatever you want. I installed it. 2 weeks go by. The other 2 weeks I said, "What do you think?" She said, "You can take my dishwasher, you can take my refrigerator, but that box is not leaving this house." I had essentially jumped over the trust gap very quickly with her, but it takes many more years for most consumers to catch up to the technology. When that thunderstorm happens, 3 things have happened around the technology. 1, it's been proven to be very dependable. 2, it's been proven to be very simple. To bridge trust, it must be simple. It's not something I have to learn. And so these, I think, are instructive in the energy space, perhaps in Rolf's space if we look at cars. There's a third factor which is disturbing to all of us technologists, and that is that for the trust gap to be bridged, we typically need a salesman there to do that work. When I say a salesman, I'm talking about one individual. So for Windows, it was a salesman called Bill Gates. For the mobile phone, for the smartphone, it was a salesman called Steve Jobs. By the way, you could buy smartphones before that. I had a couple of them. I had the Palm Pilot, it sucked. I had a bunch of Windows Phone, they sucked. But I got dependability, I got simplicity, I got a sales guy at Steve Jobs. He sold me on a smartphone. E-books, Jeff Bezos. So if you look at your world, and by the way, this is your world, not my world of energy. What the cars need is a sales guy. We need Elon Musk to be more like Henry Ford and less like Enzo Ferrari. We need him to be selling this idea to the general populace and not to digital people who made a lot of money in the digital world in Silicon Valley. So those 3 factors are very critical. There is also another factor around generations. And Forrester knows a lot about the generational behavior vis-a-vis technology. You guys all understand this, you get it intuitively, that the younger you are, the more accepting you are of technology. The older you are, your uptake is much slower. I was thinking about electric cars and the plane coming here today. And what I would say is the perfect electric car that should be built is a minivan. And I'll tell you why. It's because if you try and sell an electric car to the Z generation, they have no money. The Y generation, they have no money. If you try and sell it to the older boomers or the younger boomers, they will not accept it quickly enough. That trust gap will be difficult. The best generation to sell electric cars to is the Y generation. That's age 28 to age 40. And they're all driving minivans. So there's a very big generational component when it comes to technology uptake. And with that, I'll stop.
Okay, thank you for the invitation here. I think my colleagues here, they're real experts, I would say, on consumer behavior, purchase behavior, so which I'm not. So I would like to focus with my statements more on the engineering point of view when developing systems. And I have picked a particularly driver assistance system to explain a bit how was the challenge, or what is the challenge for an automaker to increase the customer acceptance of a driver assistance system. And I have chosen the preventive pedestrian protection system, which warns the driver in the case a pedestrian is detected and if there's a risk of a possible collision with the pedestrian. And if necessary, the system can then really release an automatic emergency braking. The most effective system, sure, that means to reduce the accidents with pedestrians, is a way that every time you see or the system detects a pedestrian nearby the street, it releases automatic emergency braking. The problem here is that we will have a lack in customer acceptance because 95–98% of the situations finally show up that these are not really serious situations because the pedestrian stopped walking, he changed the direction, he made a turn. So that means the driver gets annoyed by many wrong alarms of the system, and which results in a lack of customer acceptance of such a system. Now, what did our engineers? The engineers said, okay, how can we make the system less sensitive? That means, is there a way to predict the pedestrian behavior? We were looking into the speed, so it means we are not monitoring the speed of the pedestrian, of the walking, the direction he's going, etc., etc. And by doing this, sure, as you can imagine, you increase the uncertainty because you don't finally know the actual actions or reactions of the pedestrian or other car drivers. So by working with prediction, we increase the uncertainty and basically the challenges when designing such a system is, first of all, that there's the high uncertainty because we have to work with predictions. And secondly, the humans are much better. We can never build a system, we can never optimize sensors in a way that they can compete with humans' understanding of complex situations. So the humans are the best, the driver himself is the best judgment of a situation. For example, a sensor can never detect, for example, if the pedestrian who's walking across or nearby the street is using a smartphone or he's distracted by a bicycle driving nearby. So that means sensors can say yes or no according to criteria we have programmed them, but you can never judge these complex situations. The third point, which is very important when designing such a system, is that drivers want to have the final control of driving. They don't want to leave the system decide, now let's release an emergency braking, automatic emergency braking, so they want to be in the decision process. And finally, one very important point is that we have to consider, even if there's an emergency braking, okay, there's a car behind you perhaps driving, so, and you want to avoid the rear end collision in a conflict situation. So these are the reasons basically that we said, okay, before releasing an automatic emergency braking, first of all, we need to warn the driver of a possible risk that there's a protection nearby the street. So a very important pillar is with informing the driver, warning the driver something is going on. That could be in the near future a risky situation. At the same time, we precondition the system in a way that in the case the driver decides to make a reaction, for example, pushing the brake pedal, that the system is already preconditioned. That means there's already a braking pressure in the system, so that he just tips a slight tip on the brake pedal, releases already emergency braking. So that means we can save reaction time by doing this. So driver warning at the same time preconditioning, then the driver has some period of time to make his final decision, and only if a collision is with a high certainty will occur, then the system releases an automatic emergency braking. So you can see by combining these various pillars, considering that the driver wants to be in a final control of decisions, that humans are much better in understanding the complex situation in the traffic. Systems, technical systems can never do this in a way that human beings do, or that we have to deal with predictions, uncertainties. We have decided to go this option with driver warning, etc. And interestingly, stochastic simulation has shown that there's almost an equal effectiveness between the system I have described to you, which means informing the driver, warning driver with preconditioning, and the system which always, every time, releases an emergency braking. The effectiveness, avoiding the number of accidents, is almost the same. But in the second variant, in the second options, we can make sure at least that we have the customer acceptance of the technology, because as soon as the customer gets annoyed of a technology because it's over-warning, he gets an overflow of information, and if in the most cases it's not fulfilled, the prognosis, then the customer gets annoyed and switches off the assistant. And this is not, I think, the best way how to do it. Thank you.
Okay, this is great. So fascinating insight to a very specific problem. So I've got one question that's coming through this system, so that seems to be working. If you have any more questions, send them in. So the question, and we'll leave with that, and then I have at least one question of my own, is do we have a real-life example, this is for, I believe for Dan, but if anyone can jump in, of an example of reward substitution in the energy area? Can we think of a specific example, a real-life example of that?
So this is an experiment that Noah Goldstein did. He came to a group of people in a suburb of LA, and he asked them, he said basically, we have 3 approaches to try and convince people to save energy at home. We could tell them it would save them money. We could tell people that it's good for the environment. And we could tell people that they should do it because everybody else is doing it. And he asked people, what do you think would work? Which one of those 3 approaches would work? And, people basically said, I would be influenced by the environmental appeal, because that's the kind of person I am. My neighbors would only care about the money, because that's the kind of people they are. And nobody would care about what other people are doing. Then they actually waited a few months and they ran these experiments. Some people got the environmental appeal, some people got the financial savings, some people got everybody else is doing it. The only thing that worked was other people are doing it. Right? The financial incentive had no effect. I mean, of course, if you paid people thousands of dollars, it would have an effect, but at the level they could afford it, it didn't have anything. So I think this is a great example of people doing, again, the right thing for the wrong reasons. Now, most of the examples we have from reward substitution are not in energy. And part of the challenge is that we in the social sciences have a very hard time doing experiments with energy. So we've tried to get a hardware store to work with us. We tried to get manufacturers to work with us. I mean, we can think about trying to get gas stations to work with us. That's very tough. And we've had a relatively easy time, not terribly easy, but much easier time working with the medical profession, right? When the problems are basically the same. There's nothing in medicine that is fun to do right now, right? How many of you would like to go and have an extra colonoscopy, for example? So medicine has the same issues, and we've been doing all of those things in medicine with very nice success, I would say. The problem is that doing the infrastructure for any experiment in the energy domain is just very, very tough, so we're not doing it. But the principles are not very different, so I'm actually optimistic about it. Can I tell you very quickly about one experiment? There's one very nice experiment on Coumadin. Coumadin is an anti-stroke medication. It basically decreases the chance of a second stroke dramatically, and you would think that everybody who had a stroke would want to go on Coumadin and take it regularly, because who would want a second stroke? Turns out compliance rates are very low, and it's particularly bad because Coumadin is a blood thinner, so if you don't take it regularly, this is really bad. So this was an experiment by Kevin Volp and George Lowenstein, and they did 2 things. By the way, the first thing they tried was they gave people $3 to take the medication on time. And what do you think happened? Absolutely nothing. So they gave the same $3, but in a lottery. Right? You have a chance of getting $30. Turns out that's much better. People love lotteries. But the nicest thing they did was they combined lotteries with regret. So what is regret? Regret is about the fact that our happiness in life is not driven by where we are. It's driven by a contrast between where we are and where we could have been. And if that contrast, we feel we're worse off, we feel terrible. So we have a flight to catch. Imagine we missed our flight by 2 minutes versus by 2 hours. When would we be more miserable? Right? It's the 2 minutes. Our reality would be the same, but it's so easy to imagine the alternative reality. You could say to yourself, if the car was a little faster, if the TSA agent had one more IQ point, there's all kinds of things that would have put you on the other side of that fence, and now you can compare that reality. So in the experiment, imagine all of you on Coumadin. The people on my right are taking the medication. If we just did the lottery, we would give it to the people sitting on my right, and I would sample 10% and give you the reward. But when you try to combine regret with lotteries, you give the lottery ticket to everybody, whether you took the medication or not. And you call somebody up and you say, congratulations, it's your lucky day. The stars are smiling on you. You're the winner of the coveted lottery. Sadly, I see you did not take your pill today, so you're not getting the money. And those two tricks together got compliance rate to be 98%. Right? So here's a situation where people don't seem to care about the second stroke. They don't seem to care about $3, but if you give them $3 plus lotteries plus regret, all of a sudden you can get people to behave very differently. Now, it's not that in all cases it's lotteries and regret, but the idea is that people are not doing the right thing for the right reasons, and we can try and think about all kinds of interventions that would get people to behave as if they care about not getting a stroke, or as if they care about the future of the planet, and so on.
So in the interest of time, I think I'll move on to the next question. If anyone has something to add to that real example.
Perhaps if you allow me to add something. Okay. When we ask consumers, not only BMW customers, really consumers, average consumers, who do you think is responsible for reducing the fuel consumption of cars? The majority said is the automaker. It's the automaker followed by the government. So that means the consumer says, okay, it's not my responsibility, I'm just using the car, you are building the car, take care about it. So they move the responsibility to automakers. Sure, we have limitations in doing this. We can sure use technology innovations that reduce CO2, to increase the fuel economy. But I think one pillar what we are doing is to try to get them driving more fuel efficient is with information tools in the car, in instrumental panel. For example, when is the best way, what is the optimum timing to shift the gear, for example. So that means there are indications. Sure, there's always a balance between not overloading the driver with information, but I think informing the driver to give him signals, now it would be the best way, shifting the gear or whatever, then you can save fuel, and we have then he can monitor it in the system, in the board computer, how much fuel he has saved because of the different driving style, etc. So I think these are kind of tools we can in the future more and more use to not educate, but to a certain extent educate the driver to drive more fuel efficient. But it's not just about automakers. I think it's all stakeholders need to work together.
Yeah, and if you look at the Y generation, so Y generation is 18 to 28. They're actually very ecologically attuned. However, we asked them, would you change your behavior? And they have actually the lowest change of behavior of the other age groups. The group that's most ecologically attuned and will also change your behavior is, in fact, the Y generation. The Y generation goes from 28 to 40, which is why I said the minivan should be targeted at that point.
Great.
So that helps.
Can I say one more thing? There's one other thing that is kind of interesting, which is called the pain of paying. And the pain of paying is the idea that when we pay at the same time as we consume, we enjoy consumption less. So imagine that I owned a restaurant and I found out that people on average eat 50 bites and pay $50. And I told you that because I like you so much, I'll charge you half price. So I'll serve you your dish, and I'll charge you 50 cents per bite, and I'll charge you only for the bites you eat. So I'll serve you the dish, I'll stand next to you, and every time you take a bite, I'll mark it on my little notepad, and at the end of the meal, I'll charge you 50 cents per bite. How much fun will that meal be? right? It'll be kind of miserable. Now, this is all about, by the way, I do this in my PhD seminar. I bring pizza on the day that I talk about the psychology of money, and I charge the students 25 cents per bite. And they eat these terribly large bites, and they are really miserable at the whole thing. But, cutting, even if it's another $1.50, cutting your bites into smaller pieces, it's just painful. And if you think about in the energy domain, we have both models. We have a model of gasoline, which is very similar to the pain of paying because you stand next to it and you see it running and the amount is very clear. And then we have the electricity market in which people have no idea how much they're paying, and it comes directly into the house and they don't know really what are the consequences, and for most people automatically out of their checking account. Another way to think about it is to say, how do we increase the momentary pain that people have? So imagine that we brought back the British system in which you had to put coins in your heater. Right? Imagine this was the system. There's no question that the houses will be with a very different temperature if you had to observe it in monetary terms about exactly what's going on. It's just that we've created a system for most of the energy when we don't pay that much attention to it. So I think we can also think about how do we make the trade-offs people are making more salient and more painful at the moment.
So I had a power...
Let me jump in, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There's one question I want to make sure to get to before you guys run off the stage. And I think it gets to the heart of what a lot of people here in this audience might be concerned with. Let me just try to read this, make sure I get it exactly right. So several of the examples were around consumer products with initial capital costs and short product life. How do the same approaches apply to energy equipment investment on which the consumer has little impact? So we're thinking about, a lot of people are developing technologies where utility has to make the decision. Do we have any insights here that might apply to that kind of situation, which I think applies to a lot of people here?
Well, people are people. I mean, there's all these thoughts that once you become a professional, you develop a different brain and all of a sudden you become rational. We're in Washington. Do you think politicians have a shorter or longer time horizon than regular people, right? I mean, the truth is it's really short. I mean, business world is a world that works at best on a quarter system. I think the infrastructure situation in the US, nobody thinks it's great. It's because investing long-term in infrastructure for companies is incredibly tough. And there's another thing which is, I think naively lots of people think that competition actually improves the market. Competition can actually kill the market in these cases. Robert Frank has a very beautiful book called The Darwins Economy. And he gives this example of the elephant seals. And he says, if you're an elephant seal, what do you really want to be? You want to be the biggest, because then you get all the females, virtually all the females. If you're the second biggest, not good enough. But now the elephant seals are competing to be the biggest, and by doing so they die at a young age from vascular problems and heart problems. Sometimes they kill the females when they copulate. But with all these negative things for size, if you're the second biggest, wouldn't you try to be the biggest? Of course you would. And he gives lots of other examples of a case where competition actually kills the ecosystem. And we can think about this ideology in which competition, basically the invisible hand and so on, actually improves the condition in the market. But imagine you're a company that is competing and you're competing on the next quarter's earnings. Under what conditions are you actually going to invest long term when nobody else is doing it? There's a story about hockey. When they used to come to people that before there were helmet laws, they asked people of whether they want to wear helmets, and people said, of course not. I mean, in principle, it's a good idea, but who wants to be the only sissy to come out on the court wearing a helmet? And then they said, what if we forced everybody? I said, yes, that's a good idea. If you let people compete by themselves, we could get to a terrible situation in which everybody plays hockey without helmets, but we have to actually force a better social coordination. And, companies investing in the long term, I mean, we've just experienced lots of those fallacies not working out. I think it's a case where you need to basically force a coordination if you want any long-term investment.
Great. George, do you have
So I actually have experienced this. On Saturday, they came to my house to install a hot water heater controller, which the local power company installs. And I said, well, I don't want that. And the road that I live on, I live in Concord, Massachusetts, he went through every, not individually house, we said the number of houses on this road, you would be in the only 5% that does not have this. and your energy use will be about 15% higher because of that. And that shamed me essentially into doing that. And I think voting, and Dan, they'll send you a message in England if you don't vote. It said 95% of the people on your street voted and you did not vote, and they get huge results from this. It's really helped.
Yeah, the nicest result in England is the one that they send people a message saying 9 out of 10 people in your district have already paid their taxes.
Right.
15% improvement in tax repayment rate. Yeah. The best thing they ever did compared to increasing penalties, high probability of being caught. Really amazing.
So
shame.
Yeah, I have a big house. I think what would help me be more competitive, to be more energy efficient, would be if I was compared to all the other houses. I mean, I don't know why the local power company can't do that and just say, your consumption is X, it's 15% over. I think that this comparative shame, I don't know if that's the word you used, Dan, would be very helpful.
And there are startups that are doing that, so and making some progress with utilities. So I believe you two need to leave.
Yeah, we gotta go.
But I want to do something a little unusual. I don't want to dismiss everyone yet because we still have Rolf here, and there are a couple of questions directed specifically to him.
And BMW is coming up with some fantastic technology, so that you have a good chance to listen.
That's great.
Sorry, we have to leave.
All right, okay.
Thank you very much.
Don't pay attention to them leaving. Thank you. Okay, so a couple of questions I think that you would be great to talk about. One is, if there's a high-profile failure of something, of a new technology that you're trying to get out there, is it dead, or is there a way to kind of resurrect that? Can you get that back? Can you make up for something if there's been a high-tech, some sort of big failure?
I think a good example is alternative powertrains. We have seen it already in the 18th, 19th, electric vehicles. Almost every automaker had some electric vehicles produced and did some R&D on it. And the same was with hydrogen powertrain. And many automakers, and I must say including BMW, we believed, wrongly I must say, that in the mid or beginning 2000 to later 2010, we will see serious produced hydrogen-powered vehicles on the market. So, but we had to realize sooner or later, not only we, all the automakers, there are much more challenges that we originally have forecasted. It's the infrastructure, missing infrastructure, which costs a lot of money. It's the storage technology in the car, which was not yet ready or not yet in a stage, maturity stage, cost stage, where we could say, okay, now we can make a business case out of it. This is a prerequisite for any new technology, I think. New product you launch on the market is sooner or later you have to make money with it. We are businesses. And so that means you need to create a sustainable business case. And if you don't see this, then you have to put it on hold and to improve the technology, etc., in a way and so long as soon as you see it in the business case, sooner or later behind it. What we did, for example, on electric vehicles was we did in the meantime some basic research when we realized in the 90s, okay, it doesn't work as we were forecasting. And now you can see in the past years, you are seeing that many automakers have launched electric vehicles. We will do it in the second half of this year. It's a very exciting product. And we believe now the market and the technology is ready, which was not the case 20 years ago. When it comes to range, we have now a new generation of battery technologies. So I think it's over time. If you see you fail, I don't know, what was in the 90s with the powertrains, alternative powertrains, you don't stop it because this is, I think, the future of our business. We can't stop it completely because sooner or later we will not run out of fossil fuels, but it will become so expensive, gasoline, that we have to find alternatives. And so we have to deal with it. And if we don't succeed today, we have to then still do our R&D, basic R&D, and to improve it as long as and as good as possible. And sooner or later it will succeed.
Great. So another question here directed specifically to you. Are there ideas of driver assistance systems reducing CO2 emissions? I know you alluded to this before, but can you get a measurable impact from that kind of a system?
Well, I think it's difficult to give here an average number because it depends on the system, on the usage rate of the system. I think if we talk, I just read a number, I think in an article in a magazine, when it comes to the automatic cruise control, for example. which keeps the constant speed on the freeway so that you don't brake and push the gas pedal all the time. So that means, I think there was an estimated CO2 reduction potential 1 to 2% by doing this system. But it depends on the usage rate, and so you can only deal really with average customers, drivers. And I think to really give a range now figure is difficult, but I would say really 1 to, I don't know, 3-4%, depending on the system always.
Great. Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank our remaining panelists for a great talk.